There are a ton of conditions in Pathfinder, 42 of them actually. So I'm going to tell you what they do and why 42 is just right. If you've journeyed over from D&D 5e like I have, 42 unique conditions might sound like a lot compared to the 15 you might be used to, and it is. But if there's anything I've learned in my TTRPG experience, it's that big number equal better thing. So let's get started with the blinded condition to help you see the light along the way. Naturally, a blinded creature can't see, so all terrain becomes difficult terrain, and they'll critically fail any sight-based perception checks. Outside of this, they'll have a -4 to perception checks not entirely based on vision, but where vision might be of use. And here we should note that the blinded condition is listed to override the dazzled condition, which we'll cover in just a bit. In Pathfinder, some conditions replace others as either incremental effects or common sense mechanics, as is the case here, since being dazzled will largely rely on sight. And in other cases, some conditions affect more than just creatures, as in the broken condition. This entry is nearly exclusive to objects that become broken when its hit points are reduced below that object's BT or broken threshold. Broken objects cannot be used as normal and give no bonuses except for armor, which is rarely broken but would only incur a penalty to AC depending on its category. -1 AC for light armor, -2 for medium, and -3 for heavy. Next, we have the clumsy condition, which illustrates another unique Pathfinder hallmark if you're coming over from D&D 5e. Creatures inflicted with this condition have all of their dexterity-based checks and DCs reduced by the condition's value. In cases wherein a condition has a value, it's typically listed as a number directly after the condition itself. So, for example, clumsy 1 would reduce by 1, and clumsy 2 would reduce by 2, and so on. It's a pretty simple way to add flexibility and variability to these conditions without making them so complicated as to require you referring back to the book every single time you get a little clumsy. A lot of these conditions use this standard too, so make sure you keep it in mind as we move on to concealed. If you become concealed, it basically means that you're difficult for another creature to see, as if in a fog or maybe extremely bright light. As such, you would still be able to be observed, but become much harder to target as creatures must first succeed a DC 5 flat check to target you with an attack, spell, or other effect. And as it tends to be any other time we see such verbiage in conditions, this check occurs after your resources are spent. So if the check is failed, the action, spell slots, components, etc. are all wasted. If that sounds confusing, then, well, I'm sorry about inadvertently afflicting you with our next entry. The confused condition states that creatures don't recognize allies, can't delay, ready, or use reactions, and are also flat-footed, a common condition that we'll cover in just a bit. This condition is the first of several that nests other conditions within it to save us from having to read the same effects over and over again, and I appreciate that. This aside, the confused condition can be pretty nasty, as on the start of their turn, a confused creature uses all actions as attacks or offensive cantrips to attack random creatures as determined by the GM. And if there are no viable targets for this, the creature hits itself automatically, but if you can't even move to attack, all of your actions are just wasted until you get to attempt a DC 11 flat check to recover from the condition anytime you take damage from an attack or spell. And this lack of autonomy can get even more brutal if you become a victim of the controlled condition, which literally has another creature dictate your actions for you without having to use any of their own actions. There is usually some save built into this effect, but there is no default one as part of the condition, so be careful with it. Next, we'll cover the aforementioned dazzled condition, wherein creatures are unable to see well as a result of perhaps having dust in their eyes. As such, all other creatures and objects are considered as having the concealed condition that we discussed before. But your other senses can be afflicted too, like with the deafened condition. Creatures succumb to this entry auto-fail any perception checks that require hearing and take a -2 penalty to perception checks for initiative and other checks that only partially rely on sound. Further, actions with the auditory trait are first subject to a DC 5 flat check or otherwise lost entirely, but they are also immune to auditory effects, so perhaps this could even be useful against certain enemies. Though it'll be no help against the drained condition that causes one to suffer as a result of having blood or life force drained from them by another creature. They'll take a status penalty equal to the drained value, like what we discussed with Clumsy earlier, and lose hit points and have their max hit points reduced by their level times the drained value. From there, the drained value decreases by 1 each time they get a full night's rest, which increases their maximum hit points but doesn't immediately recover recover the hit points they lost. You might very well fall unconscious due to the drained condition, which leads us perfectly into our next several entries. You gain the unconscious condition when sleeping or knocked out, so naturally you can't act in this state, and you take a -4 penalty to AC, perception, and reflex saves. You'll also have the blinded and flat-footed conditions. I promise we'll cover that soon. Further, when you become unconscious, you'll fall prone and drop any items that you're holding at the time, unless otherwise stated, but from here, the condition acts a bit differently depending on if you're at 0 hit points or not, but we'll cover dying just after this. So for now, if you're unconscious because you're just asleep or due to some other effect that doesn't drop you to 0 hit points, you can wake up if you take damage, provided that damage doesn't drop you to 0, if you receive healing other than the natural healing you get from resting, if someone shakes you awake with the interact action, if you succeed a perception check against some noise occurring around you, or if the GM just allows you to wake after a full night's rest. If you're unconscious because you're at 0 hit points, on the other hand, it's probably because you're dying. Case in point, when characters gain the dying condition, it typically means that they've been dropped to 0 hit points or placed at death's door by some other means, and obviously, when you're dying, you are considered unconscious as well. But this condition always includes a value wherein the higher the number, the closer to death your character is, and dying 4 means you are outright dead. I covered some of this in my previous Pathfinder 2e guide for newcomers from D&D 5e, but let's touch on it again here since it's so important. When first taking the condition, you'll begin at dying 1 and need to attempt a recovery check at the start of each of your turns. A failure means your dying level increases by 1, a success decreases it by 1, a crit failure increases it by 2, and a crit success decreases it by 2. You'll also increase your dying value by 1 if you take damage while dying, or by 2 if the damage was from a crit. And the condition is removed when you reach dying 0, or if you ever have 1 hit point or more. But as some of you now know, that doesn't get you out of the woods just yet. Just about any time you'd rid yourself of the dying condition, you'll take on the wounded condition. If you weren't wounded before, you'll begin at wounded 1. But if you were, the condition's value will be increased by 1. And when you next gain the dying condition, your wounded value is added to the dying value. So a creature with wounded 2 that falls to 0 hit points will typically be set to dying 3 instead of dying 1, and that's 1 bad roll away from death. Or is it? The doomed condition is one that decreases the value at which you die from the dying condition. So, for example, it may just move the death threshold from dying 4 down to dying 3 if you have doomed 1, or even dying 2 if you have doomed 2. Being doomed will fade gradually as its value decreases by 1 each time you get a full night's rest, but if it ever causes your maximum dying value to reach dying 0, you just die instantly, so it can be extremely dangerous. It's actually part of why I really prefer the mechanics of dying in Pathfinder 2e compared to other systems. It leverages the intensity of being on death's door quite well. But moving back towards some more benign conditions, we have encumbered, which basically happens when a character is carrying more weight than they can manage. This results in them taking on the clumsy 1 condition and a 10-foot movement penalty that can't lower their speed below 5 feet total. And if that leaves you feeling weak, just wait until you become enfeebled. This condition gives creatures a status penalty equal to the enfeebled value for strength-based rolls and DCs. Next, the fascinated condition denotes creatures that are distracted by something, causing them to take a -2 penalty to all perception and skill checks, but the condition does end if a hostile action is taken against the fascinated creature or any of their allies. Fatigued creatures, like most people, are so tired that they take a -1 status penalty to AC and saving throws and can't take the exploration activity. The condition ends after a full night's rest, but we'll sleep when we're dead. And finally, we come to flat-footed, probably one of the most common conditions in the game. Flat-footed creatures basically just take a -2 circumstance penalty to AC that sometimes only applies against attacks from certain creatures, but if it doesn't specify, it means that you're flat-footed against everything. Like I said, this one gets used a lot, so keep it in mind. The fleeing condition is given to characters that succumb to fear or some other effect that forces them to run away, and when fleeing, you must spend all actions trying to escape the source of your fleeing condition as quickly as possible while you can't delay or ready actions either. But you won't even have to worry about all that if your enemy is friendly towards you. Typically, being friendly is a condition that extends only to certain creatures as part of a magical spell or effect, but it makes the creature likely to help a character when propositioned with a request that is safe and doesn't cost much for them to do. There is a limit to this, however, as friendly creatures may lose this condition if a hostile action is taken against them. And the same goes for the better version of friendly, the helpful condition. Helpful creatures will actively seek to aid the source of this condition, but won't do so at the expense of their own goals or quality of life. On the other end of the spectrum, hostile creatures wish to actively do harm against a specific creature or character, and the lesser version, unfriendly, means that although creatures or characters may not seek to harm a particular individual, they will be generally distrustful of them and won't accept requests from that individual. And somewhere in the middle of all this, an indifferent creature has no particular investment one way or another in a specific character or creature. While this also can be the result of some magical effect, it is most often assumed that many characters are indifferent to others unless otherwise specified. Next, grabbed creatures are held in place by another creature and become both flat-footed and immobilized, which we'll cover in a second. And they can't use the manipulate action unless they succeed on a DC 5 flat check first. The observed condition is the first in a series that help to describe how creatures might be seen or unseen in your games. Naturally, anything within plain view is considered to be observed. However, if an observed creature makes an effort to hide, it can become hidden or undetected from you. Additionally, you can only observe creatures with precise senses, which typically refers to your vision, but some characters might have more precise senses that allow you to observe all the same. Now, when a creature is hidden from another, the other creature knows the space that they're in, but can't pinpoint exactly where they are. This most often occurs when using stealth to hide, and creatures you're hidden from can only seek you out with imprecise senses, are thusly flat-footed to you, and must succeed a DC 11 flat check to target you. Taking this a step further, creatures that are undetected by another gain similar benefits, but also subject the other creature to a blind attempt at guessing where the undetected creature might be. The seeking creature must randomly choose a space in an attempt to target the undetected creature and succeed the aforementioned DC 11 flat check on top of that to succeed. But sometimes your enemies might not even be aware of your presence at all, in which case you would be unnoticed. Unnoticed creatures are also considered undetected, but the unaware enemy wouldn't even be able to attempt an attack on you at all. And certain features and abilities also rely on being unnoticed beyond this. Now, you might think that the invisible condition grants you the unnoticed condition automatically, but this is distinctly not so. Instead, it grants you the undetected condition and allows creatures to seek you with a perception check against your stealth DC if they know that you're there, at which point you would simply be hidden to them. And if you become invisible while an enemy can already see you, you are simply hidden to them instead of undetected until you successfully sneak away from them. Also, it's important to note here that being invisible doesn't just limit your enemy's vision of you. This condition also states that invisible creatures cannot be observed at all without special abilities or magic. I love how Pathfinder handles this, spelling out exactly what enemies can and can't do in this game of cat and mouse, versus other systems that typically leave this situation up to the DM to decide in what ultimately feels a bit unrefined and clunky on the player side of things. Moving on, or maybe not, Immobilized states that you can't use any action with the move trait, and if some other force were to move you and something was holding you in place, it would need to first exceed the DC of the effect holding you there. But things are even worse if you happen to be paralyzed, as paralyzed creatures are flat-footed and completely frozen in place. They can still see, but they can't even move their eyes, so even that is limited. All they can really do is take the recall knowledge action so they can think about the mistakes that got them there in the first place. Speaking of mistakes, let's tackle the persistent damage condition. As you might guess, the persistent damage condition might relate to being poisoned or being on fire and taking damage consistently each round. Instead of having a value like other conditions, this condition is noted as X persistent type damage, where X is the amount of damage and, well, you get the rest. What you may not realize is that this damage can be doubled or halved as normal with crit successes and crit fails on attacks and saves, and you'll take damage at the end of each turn if you still have the condition. After you take that damage, you'll roll against a DC 15 flat check to see if you recover from the condition or not. That said, you and your allies can take additional steps to recover from persistent damage that might result in an extra recovery attempt in exchange for 2 actions to perform the help activity. What this ends up doing specifically can vary with the GM's discretion, but it's good to know that the option exists. Finally, you can have more than 1 persistent damage condition at a time so long as the damage types are different. If they are the same, you are affected by the highest damaging one. This works similarly to normal conditions where you typically would just be affected by 1 of 2 redundant conditions at a time. Specifically, when you're affected by the same condition twice, you'll just take on the longer of the 2. However, if you're affected by the same condition with a different value multiple times, you'll be affected by the more severe of the 2 only, while keeping track of the less severe condition, as the lesser may take over when the more severe ends. For example, if you're enfeebled 4 for 1 turn and enfeebled 1 for 3 turns, you would just be enfeebled 4 for the first turn and then enfeebled 1 for the remaining 2. Admittedly, this circumstance might be rare, but I felt it was worth pointing out so you weren't left in the dark. But now, let's move on to the petrified condition. Petrified creatures are actually no longer creatures and become an object instead with double their usual bulk, 9 AC, 8 hardness, and the same hit points they had before, with bulk being a measurement of how hard it is to move or carry something. If your hit points reach 0 and the stone statue you became is destroyed, there's no putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, and you will die immediately. But while made of stone, you at least don't age or notice the passing of time. Next, prone creatures are considered flat-footed and also take a -2 circumstance penalty to their attack rolls. They're also limited to crawl and stand as they're only 2 movement actions, but they can take cover while prone even without cover to gain a +4 bonus to AC against ranged attacks. From there, it's worth noting that you'll fall immediately if you become prone while flying or climbing, but you cannot become prone while swimming. Next, quickened creatures gain an additional action at the start of each turn, but multiple quickened sources do not grant multiple actions, and the type of actions that you can take are usually limited to certain options depending on what quickened you. Additionally, you should keep in mind that you gain the action at the start of your turn, so you wouldn't get this effect if you became quickened partway through your turn. In contrast to this, slowed creatures lose a number of actions on each turn equal to the value of the slowed condition. As you might guess, the effect also takes place at the start of your turn, so you won't lose actions if you're slowed during your turn. Restrained creatures are flat-footed and immobilized and can't use any actions with the attack or manipulate traits unless they're attempting to escape or force open their bonds. Restrained also overrides the grabbed condition, so those effects won't stack if you happen to be subjected to both. Creatures that feel ill take on the sickened condition in varying degrees depending on the sickened value. A status penalty is incurred equal to the value on all checks and DCs, and you cannot willingly ingest anything, including potions and elixirs. You can instead spend an action throwing up in an attempt to recover with a fortitude save against the DC of the effect that made you ill, reducing the value by 1 on a success or 2 on a crit success. Now we arrive at the stunned condition. Those of you that have seen my 5e videos will know that I hold D&D's stun in high regard, and Pathfinder makes no exception to that, but it does change the way stun works a bit. Stunned creatures cannot act and typically have a value associated with their condition. This value essentially represents how many actions you lose and decreases as you lose each action. So, for example, Stunned 4 would see you lose an entire normal round and 1 action in the subsequent round. The condition can also have a time duration rather than a value and overrides the slow condition. But if your stun condition ends while you're slowed, any actions lost on that turn can be counted towards actions you would lose from slow. For example, if you were stunned 1 and slowed 2 at the start of your turn, you would lose 1 action from being stunned and then only lose 1 more action from being slowed. Good to know. Then stupefied creatures take a status penalty equal to the stupefied value on intelligence, wisdom, and charisma-based checks and DCs. And casting a spell becomes impossible while stupefied unless you are able to succeed a flat check against 5 plus your stupefied value. As it has been with most of my foray into Pathfinder 2e, conditions like this one may seem a bit complex on the surface, but add a ton of detail, flexibility, and flavor to the game that I think is a worthwhile trade-off compared to D&D 5e system that feels a little stale after some time playing with it. If you're still watching the video and you're not stupefied, don't forget to like and subscribe, and now go out there and make some chaos.